Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, good afternoon, Dublin, Sheffield, and good evening, Japan. Wherever you are, Fortune Golair. Welcome to UCD Japan Fair 2020, UCD Japan Fair 2020へようこそ。My name is Naonori Kodate, Associate Professor in Social Policy and Co-Chair of UCD Japan. Together with Team Japan in UCD, we would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Post-Abe Japan and Political Leadership, with Professor Hugo Dobson, together with Mr. Bill Emmott. And thank you all very much for joining us at the end of a very hectic week. This event is organized in collaboration with UCD Japanese Society, the Embassy of Japan in Ireland, Island Japan Association, Experience Japan, and the UCD Center for Japanese Studies. This session is the fifth and last event of the 2-month-long UCD Japan Fair 2020. Just to give you a little bit of background, UCD Japan Group was established in 2016. The origin of the UCD Japan Group was very interdisciplinary, spanning natural sciences, technology, medicine, social sciences, arts, and humanities. We have organized many seminars and events, both in Ireland and Japan in the last 4 years. We have been providing academic support, highlighting our research, scholarships, and research funding opportunities for both students and staff, as well as creating academic industry collaboration links. We provide support for both UCD and Japanese partners, while engaging with our own research projects involving Patrick Lafcadio-Hearn, Koizumi Yakumo, the use of robotics in social care, infectious disease, data science, laser plasma physics, gender equality, public diplomacy, and teaching and learning methods of mathematics and the Japanese language. Of course, we are very keen on politics in Japan and its foreign policy as well, which is today's topic. UCD Japan and the UCD Center for Japanese Studies are now offering an elective discovery module entitled Gateways to Japan in trimester 2 for UCD undergraduate students, which will start in January 2021, on top of Japanese language and culture modules, allowing students to progress their levels. UCD School of History offers a long-standing module called Rise, Fall, Rise of Modern Japan, taught by Dr. Declan Downey, who has just been awarded the commendation of Foreign Minister of Japan. Congratulations to Dr. Downey, Declan Sensei, Kogojus, and omedetou gozaimasu. UCD Japan also organizes cultural events, working closely with Experience Japan, founded in 2010, where Japanese societies in UCD, Dublin City University, and other are actively involved as volunteers. As you may know, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan awarded Mr. O'Donnell as the founding chairperson of Experience Japan, and also the Experience Japan Taiko drumming, Japanese drumming team, led by Ms. Nobuko Ichichi on separate occasions. The festival is now widely recognized as a National Japan Day in the Irish calendar. Now, I would like to open today's plenary webinar with Ambassador of Japan in Ireland, His Excellency Mr. Mitsuru Kitano. Ambassador Kitano very kindly sent us this message.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to UCD Center for Japanese Studies for organizing the UCD Japan Fair. It is sad that this event cannot be held in the lecture hall due to COVID-19. Nevertheless, I would like to welcome it being held as a virtual format, since it is an extremely useful event to get to know about Japan. I would like to offer my congratulations on the establishment of the UCD Center for Japanese Studies in April this year. I welcome the first UCD Japan Fair for the newly established center. Today's lecture by Professor Hugo Dobson is on the theme of Japanese politics. Needless to say, politics determines the basic direction of the country, be it in the East or the West. In Ireland, the general election in February led to the current three-party coalition government. You know what happened in the US. In Japan, after over 7-year premiership of Abe Shinzo, Suga Yoshihide took him over as prime minister in September. With this, Japanese politics entered a new chapter. Prime Minister Suga emphasizes the importance of realizing a digitalized society and a green society. his new political initiative will certainly create a new direction for Japan. I hope that active discussions on Japanese politics will take place from various perspectives at today's seminar. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Kitano Taishi, Ambassador Kitano, thank you very much. And now, before I hand over to Professor John Neary, I would like to say we will have a panel discussion at the end of this session. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit questions during the talk. Now, Professor Neary is our valued member of the UCD Center for Japanese Studies and former ambassador of Ireland to Japan. To introduce today's speaker and respondent. Over to you, Professor Neary.
Thank you very much, Professor Kodate. I am delighted to welcome today's speaker, Professor Hugo Dobson, and the respondent, Mr. Bill Emmett. First, Mr. Bill Emmett is the chairperson of the Japan Society in the United Kingdom and was previously editor-in-chief of The Economist from 1993 until 2006. He is a fellow of Tokyo College, which is the University of Tokyo's new interdisciplinary research institute. He also chairs the board of Trinity College Dublin's Long Room Hub for the Arts and Humanities and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He has written 8 books on Japan, the first of which was The Sun Also Sets, Why Japan Will Not Be Number One, which was published in 1989. His most recent book, which has just been published, is called Japan's Far More Female Future. And then today's speaker, Professor Hugo Dobson, is Professor of Japan's International Relations in the National Institute of Japanese Studies at the University of Sheffield in England. Professor Dobson's research interests include multilateral organizations and global governance, especially the G7 and the G20 and Japan's role in those groups. His research also explores the role of images in shaping our understanding of international relations and Japan's role in the world. Images from postage stamps and logos to TV programs such as The Simpsons. He has been invited to teach and research at various institutions around the world, including the University of Tokyo, Kobe University, Hosei University, Zurich University, and Charles University in Prague. He has received a number of teaching awards related to his work with the Global Learning Opportunities in the Social Sciences Initiative at the University of Sheffield. Professor Dobson is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He will speak for 30 minutes and will be followed by Mr. Emmett's response. And after that, as Professor Kodate said, there will be a Q&A session. So thank you very much. And now it's with great pleasure that I hand over the virtual floor to you, Professor Dobson.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, John. Let me see if I can operate the technology and share my screen with you. So first of all, I should really declare a conflict of interest here. I've known Kodate-san, or Naokun, as we naturally call him, for over 20 years now. And we first met when we were both at Tokyo University in the 1990s. So it was a pleasure to be invited by now to talk to you today. And my only regret is that we can't do this in person. I would have loved to be in the same room as you in Dublin, to have the chance to catch up with old friends, to meet new ones, to visit family in County Wexford, and also to enjoy a pint of Guinness. However, I do have my Guinness pint glass with me, even if it only has water in it. So what I'm going to talk about today is political leadership in the Japanese context, and especially with the resignation of Abe Shinzo and the election of Suga Yoshihide as leader of the LDP and Prime Minister of Japan earlier this year. But before we think about this specific development, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we understand prime ministerial leadership specifically, and also comparatively in relation to the United Kingdom. Back in 2017, I was lucky enough to lead a team of researchers in a funding application to the Economic and Social Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who had made a call for applications for seed funding aimed at fostering the development of long-term relationships with Japanese researchers. Our team included myself and Matthew Flinders from the University of Sheffield, Caroline Rose and Tim Heppel from Leeds University, the second best university in Yorkshire, Uchiyama Yu from Tokyo University, Takayasu Kensuke from Seikei University, and Shinoda Tomohito from the International University of Japan. In terms of timing, it seemed like a perfect opportunity to look at the two countries' experience of prime ministerial leadership in comparison. And what we're doing in this project is exploring the phenomenon that the Prime Minister is becoming stronger in Japan at the same time that the UK Prime Minister seems to be weakening. Traditionally, the Japanese Prime Minister has been regarded as a transient, weak, compromise figure, but this has changed in recent years, especially since December 2012 and Abe 2.0, the second Abe administration. In the UK, in contrast, intra-party and executive legislative dynamics have shifted in a way that has weakened the position of the Prime Minister, especially since 2010 and the advent of coalition governments. Now, one way to capture this development from my own research in global summitry is to look at the attendance of some of these leaders at G7 and G8 summits. And this is a slide that I regularly use in my teaching, and if any of my students are listening to me, they'll have probably seen this used many times. But one thing that this demonstrates is that there's a relatively small number of UK Prime Ministers and a high number of Japanese Prime Ministers who've attended these various G7 and G8 summits from 1975 through to 2019. And this captures that transient nature of the Japanese Prime Minister. This was also nicely captured by former Brazilian President Lula da Silva at the G20 summit, when he was criticised at a press conference for not remembering the Japanese Prime Minister's name, and his response was, well, do we need to bother remembering his name? It will be one guy in the morning and another guy in the afternoon. Now, there have been occasions when Japanese Prime Ministers have stuck around. Nakasone and Koizumi stand out as two examples, but these coincided with strong UK Prime Ministers, Thatcher and Blair, who also stuck around for a while. What we've seen in the UK since 2010 is coalition governments and weak Prime Ministers, like May, for example, Theresa May, while in Japan since 2012, we seem to have seen strong and stable, durable Prime Ministers, particularly in the shape of Abe Shinzo. So it seems that the two countries are moving in opposite directions over recent years. Now, apologies for crowbarring in this image shamelessly, but another way to capture the sort of transient nature of the Japanese Prime Minister is to look at the revolving door of Japanese Prime Ministers. And this is marvelously captured in this image, which was created by an ex-student of mine, and I'd like to share it with you. This was made by Kelly Harlock, who studied at Sheffield University and took my Japanese politics module. She's now the classical music editor for Spotify and hosts a podcast called That Classical Music Podcast, which I highly recommend to you. But this demonstrates nicely the Magnificent Seven, I guess, the revolving door of Japanese prime ministers, which began with Abe Shinzo as a short-lived prime minister with his first administration, but then ended with him in December 2012, becoming Japan's longest-serving prime minister. Now, we're not in this project suggesting that the two phenomena are in any way connected in a causal sense, but it did prompt us to ask a number of questions as regards the nature of prime ministerial leadership, or the lack of it, and what the two sides, what the two countries might learn from each other. So far, as part of the project, we held an initial meeting in Sheffield in April 2019. And later that year, we had a one-day workshop at Hosei University in Tokyo, attended by a number of Japanese researchers and political leadership, as well as former Prime Minister Fukuda Yasuo. We also held a seminar at the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation in London at the beginning of this year, which obviously seems like a million years ago. And we're currently planning for a one-day event in Westminster next year. We hope to make a larger grant application next year as well, and publish a special issue of the journal Asian Journal of Comparative Politics, which will capture certain aspects of this project. But how have we traditionally understood prime ministerial leadership, and what are the existing perspectives? Let me share a graphic with you that I produced. So the focus is usually placed on three mid-range factors to understand prime ministerial leadership. So looking at the graphic, you can see the grey circle of executive politics. So looking at the centrality of the prime minister's role through to the idea of cabinet government, and extending beyond that to core executive studies, the idea that there are other individuals and other institutions that come into play in providing a core executive that makes the decisions. That's one of the traditional understandings of how prime ministers demonstrate leadership. The second mid-range factor is party leadership. So an emphasis has been placed on the fact that the prime minister of the day is also the leader of a party and has to manage intra-party dynamics, and that will affect his or her ability to lead. And thirdly, skills and style. An individual prime minister's performative skills and styles have also been focused upon, and how they relate to their ability, their competence in governing. And this can include an emphasis on the personalisation of politics, or more recently celebrity politics, but also in the UK and Japan, how the role of the Prime Minister is becoming more presidentialised. However, we wondered, looking at the existing literature, whether we were missing out on something here, whether we need to look at the micro level and at the macro level. So at the micro level, we wondered if there was something to include as regards psychological aspects of individual prime ministers. So take, for example, Boris Johnson's self-perception of himself as a heroic Churchillian figure. This would help explain Boris Johnson's behaviour. At the macro level, we wondered about the broader context within which prime ministers are operating. And if you look at the UK and Japan, they are sharing a number of overarching challenges, whether that is the changing nature of work, or rising inequalities, rising populism, anti-politics, and of course the pandemic, which has exacerbated all of those things. At the same time, within this context, there are shared anchorage points. Take, for example, the royal or imperial families, which provide something that people can latch onto in a time of instability. Of course, all of these things are interconnected, as is shown in the case of Tony Blair. He was able to exert prime ministerial leadership because he had large parliamentary majorities. He managed his party effectively. However, that majority was a consequence of his performance as leader of the opposition and his ability to shift voter perceptions about the Labour Party. And this was in consequence of his personal leadership skills and how he repackaged the Labour Party on the centre ground of British politics. Conversely, he also contributed negatively to his own operating environment as a result of his intervention in Iraq. So let's apply this framework now to the UK before we move on to look at Japan. Now, I realise in this slide that there's a lot of detail going on there, and I'm not going to go through all of it. you can take a look at each of those three prime ministers and agree or disagree with some of the points that I put in there to try and flesh out the framework. But let's look at the case of Theresa May. So Theresa May was Prime Minister for 3 years, from July 2016 to July 2019. What context was she operating in? What was the overarching, the macro level context in which she was operating? Well, she became Prime Minister in the aftermath of David Cameron's resignation and the Brexit referendum. So she was plunged into an immediately challenging environment. And this was exacerbated by continuing austerity and rising populism. This was probably the most challenging environment for any post-war British Prime Minister to have to deal with. So already she's on the back foot because of the context, because of the overarching environment in which she's operating. As regards executive politics, well, she promised to try and provide strong leadership, but she was never fully in charge of her cabinet. She has one of the highest rates of cabinet resignations of any prime minister. Now, she tried to address this by calling an election in 2017. As part of that, she adopted a presidential campaign stressing strong and stable, and we all know that that backfired and she lost her majority. An election which she didn't really need to fight either. In terms of party dynamic, she was further crippled because of the scale of divisions within the Conservative Party between Remainers and Leave elements. She was ultimately unable to heal a divided party, and as a result of that election in 2017, she was dependent upon Democratic Unionists. So ultimately, she became leader in name only for the last 2 years of her premiership. And she was weakened throughout that time by constant discussion about her resignation. Now, as regards skills and style, another leader might have been able to fall back on their personal skills and their style and utilise them to try and deal with such a hostile environment and a divided party. But May was clearly not a people person, uncomfortable with the public, unable to be a brand for a party, seemed very uncomfortable using small talk, and didn't express a high degree of emotional intelligence. Very poor in dealing with the media as well. Now, she may have been a good prime minister in calmer, more normal times, but she didn't have that skill set that could be used in such a challenging environment. And if we then look at the psychological factors, what we see is a rather conformist, introverted leader. The characteristic that lingers in people's minds is the term Maybot, the idea that she was rather robotic in her approach to dealing with people. Unable to make tough decisions and kept changing her mind. There were questions throughout her premiership as to how she was able to cope with the pressure. And if you remember her resignation speech outside Number 10, it contrasts quite starkly with the resignation speech of David Cameron outside Number 10. Theresa May gave a very emotional speech and returned into Number 10 in tears, whereas David Cameron gave his speech and then nonchalantly walked back to Number 10 whistling. So there was clear difference between the two leaders in terms of psychological aspects. So taking this full approach, maybe we can understand why May struggled so much. It's not just one factor. And ultimately, although she was Prime Minister for 3 years, she was only really leading for the first 12 months and then clinging on to power for the remaining 24 months. So now let's apply this framework to the case of Japan. And again, I've provided you with a lot of detail there, which you can look at in your own time. I've included Abe 1.0 there because there's the obvious interesting comparison between the second Abe administration and the first Abe administration. How do we account for such a stark difference, a short-lived administration from 2006 to 2007 versus Japan's longest-serving prime minister in his second administration? I've also included Prime Minister Kan Naoto there, who obviously had a very hostile environment with the triple disasters of 3/11 to deal with. But I'm going to look specifically here at Abe 2.0. So again, what's the context? Well, there are a number of opportunities for Abe. The Tokyo Olympics provides a very obvious opportunity for Abe to operate on the world stage. And also importantly, he has a plan. He knows what he wants to do in terms of Abenomics and reviving Japan's economy, which is going to largely bankroll his other foreign policy initiatives. Now, there are the threats of the rise of China and the threat of North Korea, but Abe is able to use those external threats to his own advantage, and successfully does that in terms of calling snap elections and able to win large majorities. So although there are challenges in that environment, Abe is skillful in using them to his own advantage. And there are also opportunities there for Abe. So it's a relatively positive environment for Abe. In terms of executive politics, Abe has a very strong core executive. Now, this is a result partly of reforms that have gone back to Prime Minister Obuchi Keizo 20 years ago, but these have been built upon by Abe. So in December 2013, Abe establishes a US-style National Security Council in the Prime Minister's office. His selection of cabinet ministers and senior bureaucrats is much more robust than his first term in power. He controls his cabinet more closely, requiring ministers to have their speeches approved. So there's a very strong core executive there that Abe leads. In terms of party dynamics, I think the word that describes this is dominance. Abe is able to win 3 terms as LDP president. There was talk about a possible 4th, and partly this was driven by the fact that there was no obvious rival to Abe. In terms of his skill set and style, the phrase that captured Abe's second administration was that Japan is back. And I'm sure we can all remember that famous cover of The Economist magazine that has Abe dressed as Superman. Japan was back, but also Japan was strong and stable. Now, a phrase associated ironically with Theresa May probably applies better to Abe, especially when he's faced by a very fractured opposition and external threats that I've already mentioned. Abe was also able to manage the media very closely and even at times use celebrity politics. I think we can remember his appearance at the closing ceremony of the Rio Olympics, dressed as Super Mario. And finally, psychological aspects. Now, Abe is obviously a patriot, and this feeds through a lot of his behavior. But I think that it would be difficult to understand the success of Abe's second administration compared to the failure of his first administration if you didn't take into account the factor of redemption. Abe was presented with the rare second attempt at being a prime minister in Japanese politics. Only Yoshida Shigeru had had that opportunity in the post-war period. So this was really a chance for Abe to prove himself as prime minister. And to that extent, he seemed to have learned from a lot of his mistakes from the first administration. So in that way, we can understand when prime ministerial leadership is in evidence and when it's lacking. How can we apply this framework to Japan's current prime minister, Suga, and possibly make some predictions about his premiership? Now, first of all, I should give a word of warning about social scientists making predictions. If you go back to December 2012, I'm not sure that I would have predicted Abe's longevity. I'm not sure many people would have done. So take everything I say with a pinch of salt. Thankfully, I'm not being held accountable for my predictions. And there is a certain irony that the word academic has 2 meanings. Be warned that in what I say, it might be academic in both senses of the word. But with Suga, the received wisdom is that it's going to be business as usual. He's the continuity candidate. He's going to benefit from a lot of the factors that Abe benefited from in terms of the context and in terms of the executive politics and the party dynamics. He's also going to benefit from his long tenure as chief cabinet secretary. And in terms of domestic policy, we can see some modest initiatives that he's introduced already. Lowering mobile tariffs, the hometown tax that he's introduced. In terms of foreign policy, again, we can see continuity. He's been trying to shore up the US alliance. Interesting that his selection of Vietnam and Indonesia as the first destinations for his overseas visits was the same as Shinzo Abe. This is also part of Suga emphasizing Abe's free and open Indo-Pacific vision, and a constant emphasis on the rule of law in the South China Sea. So this is all very much continuity with Abe's foreign policy as well. Now, some differences that have been highlighted and suggested by Takahashi Toshiya in a recent post on East Asia Forum blog, are that Suga is going to put more of his energy into domestic policy than foreign policy compared with Abe, and also that he'll be less ideologically motivated than Abe. But I think another aspect in which Suga might differ is in terms of the personality and the interpersonal skills, the skills and style that I've spoken about that forms part of prime ministerial leadership. When we talk about Japanese prime ministers using their personality and their interpersonal skills as a resource, Koizumi provides the classic example of a prime minister able to make use of them to circumvent opposition in his own party and appeal directly to the Japanese electorate. Now, Abe may not have had the personality of Koizumi as a resource at his deployment, but he did have the energy, and we know how many foreign trips he undertook in his pursuit of raising Japan's profile overseas. And as I said, he would even be willing to put on a Super Mario outfit and attend the Rio Olympics closing ceremony. Now, these skills, these interpersonal skills, are particularly a factor when it comes to global summits. So I'm returning to my specific research focus, as mentioned by John in the introduction. Now, these informal gatherings of world leaders in forums like the G7 and the G20 very much rely on the personal encounter of leaders. They rely on the interpersonal connections and relationships that individual leaders can build up between each other, and how that can provide the momentum, the political leadership, to make a breakthrough on the issue of the day. Now, luckily for Suga, the G20 summit that took place a couple of weekends ago was virtual. And it did result in one of the most awkward leaders' photos to have been taken at one of these global summits. But also with it being online, it removed, to an extent, the interpersonal encounter. Now, certainly all the leaders look very wooden in this badly photoshopped family photo. And although Suga does take prime spot, this is only because Japan hosted the G20 summit last year. But within this sort of array of very wooden-looking leaders, Suga does strike me as possibly lacking the personality, the interpersonal skills, the authentic leadership, call it what you will, that Koizumi was able to display and that Abe was able to tap into. Looking at his background and experience, Suga is definitely the kind of political operator that you would want on your side. Unlike Abe, who was born to be a politician, Suga is a self-made man. He's worked his way up the greasy pole of Japanese politics, conservative in temperament, self-disciplined, very much pays attention to the detail and knows how to get things done within Japan's bureaucracy. Able to build coalitions, good at operating behind the scenes, unpretentious, modest, emotionless even. So he seems ideally suited for the role of the Chief Cabinet Secretary, as he was from December 2012 under Abe. However, his crisis management skills have been questioned during the pandemic, and in the absence of a vision and strategy of his own, I'm not convinced that his skill set will translate into the kind of leadership that we've been treated to under Koizumi and Abe, who admittedly could be seen as the exception rather than the rule, but this kind of leadership is going to be necessary in the current regional and global order. On top of this, don't forget that Suga does face a number of challenges in the immediate future. He's going to have a LDP leadership election, another one in September 2021. There's going to be an election for the House of Representatives that has to take place by October 2021. Rising coronavirus infection rate, the obvious economic fallout of that, the logistics around the rollout of a vaccine, a new president in the White House to figure out, and a postponed Olympics to organise. All this would have been challenging enough for a leader like Koizumi, but not insurmountable. So my wild prediction is that events and Suga himself and his skill set will mean that he goes down in history as a short-lived prime minister. Whether this then leads to the return of a revolving door of Japanese prime ministers remains to be seen. So I think I'm going to stop there and give time to Bill to comment, and also for people to ask questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Good afternoon to everyone. Konnichiwa, yoroshiku onegaishimasu. And thank you very much to Hugo Dobson for a very stimulating and thought-provoking lecture and framework within which to think and analyze both Japanese and British politics. I'm just going to offer a few thoughts in response that will be somewhat more critical of Prime Minister Abe than Professor Dobson, but that seek to apply something of the same sort of way of thinking about leadership and strength and weakness in a leader. Really, for the sake of discussion. Professor Dobson's thoughts on leadership and the structure and the framework that he put made me reflect a bit on the nature and meaning of strength and weakness, as well as leadership in politics. There's no doubt that Prime Minister Abe can be described as having been strong, since he managed to survive such a long time in government, 7 years in Abe 2.0, a record, winning 4 elections with very comfortable majorities, and he certainly won international recognition extremely successfully. But relative to that 7-year timeline and all of those election victories and those majorities, he has a pretty limited legacy of reform to leave behind him. Number one claim that he was going to do was Abenomics, and there's no doubt that he succeeded in putting a word into the language with Abenomics, but he didn't actually achieve any marked improvement in Japan's economic performance. He did stabilize or preside over a stabilization of the Japanese economy, but I would argue that that can be attributed largely to the absence during those 7 years until coronavirus of any external or internal shock. His predecessor had the tsunami and earthquake, terrible tsunami and earthquake of 2011. Now there's the coronavirus shock. The 7 years were arguably lucky years. And monetary policy didn't succeed in eliminating deflation. Economic growth, at least the potential growth rate, didn't improve on OECD reckoning. So the question is, what does Abenomics really leave behind? Second ambition was, of course, constitutional reform. This is what he declared that he'd gone into politics to achieve. This was his birthright from his grandfather, Kishi, Prime Minister Kishi. Nothing, essentially, major was achieved on constitutional reform. He achieved a moderate revision of cabinet rules on collective defense, but he did not succeed in even presenting to Parliament a substantial proposal for constitutional reform, let alone getting agreement to it. Institutional reform, I would say that he did achieve some more progress, as actually Professor Dobson outlined in the institutional structure of government. And I think one could say in issues like corporate governance reform, some of the rule-making, as it were, role of government for the private sector, and some reforms to labor legislation, which were significant. But if one measures all of this against 7 years in government and massive majorities in some cases, actually it isn't transformative. If you looked at Blair and Thatcher, you saw rather more significant transformations. So why? Why was this strong man actually surprisingly weak in that sense? And I'm obviously being provocative with my declaration in that way, but why was this strong man so weak? Well, I think a thing that one needs to look at in the Japanese politics is the somewhat enigmatic role of the Komeito party within coalition government. the ruling party, the Liberal Democratic Party, as it were, historic ruling party for most of the period since 1955, has, since 2012, been in coalition with Komeito, essentially the political arm of the Soka Gakkai Buddhist sect. Massive religious organization, substantial party, not all that many seats in parliament, centrist and pacifist in its nature, although that's its official position rather than necessarily how one should interpret all of its instincts. So why did it have to be in the government? You could say it needed to be there in order to make constitutional reform possible, because it brought at times the 2/3 majorities that were necessary if anything was to happen, but almost by definition, it made it impossible, since it's a pacifist party. It could not have agreed to a revision of Article 9 of the Constitution, for example. So why is it there, is my question. And I think part of the answer is that the LDP generally, and Prime Minister Abe specifically, are actually weaker than they look. They need Komeito's support, not simply the seats in parliament, but actually in electoral alliances to bring out voters for their own MPs. The LDP actually feels more vulnerable than the numbers and the apparent weakness of the opposition seems to suggest, and benefits very much from the get out the vote efforts done for it in some constituencies, or many constituencies, by Komeito. Mr. Yamaguchi, the head of Komeito, is the longest serving party leader in Japan. He's been there longer than Prime Minister Abe was as Prime Minister. So you've got an enigmatic heart of, if you like, Japanese politics that I think actually deserves more scrutiny broadly than it gets. But it seems to suggest that the LDP doesn't feel that strong. Final third point, well, no, actually I'll make two related more points. The third point is that I do think the institutional evolution that's happened has been important. It does go back, as Professor Dobson said, back into Prime Minister Ubuchi and beyond. Koizumi did a lot of strengthening of the central institutions of the cabinet as well. I think that you could even track some continuity in this centralization of power and strengthening of politics against the bureaucracy with the short-lived and not terribly successful period in government of the Democratic Party of Japan, also from 2009 to 2012. They continued some of this, and now we will see more, I think, under Prime Minister Suga, including the new digital agency that he's described, his declared effort to try to eliminate silo mentalities, Tatewari Gyosei in Japanese. That is actually a lot about central control from both the political party and the Prime Minister's office. So I think that is actually a very strong and important evolution in Japanese politics. But the related extra point is to ask the question, why weren't there more economic reforms? Why is inequality actually essentially been unaddressed under both Abe 1.0 and Abe 2.0? Why does Japan continue to follow what I would describe as a cheap labor strategy of 40% of the workforce on precarious short-term contracts, with real wages having basically performed the worst in the G7, apart from Italy, over the past 15 years? Why, and which also means household demand has been pretty weak. Why is that? Well, I would say that big business is still extremely powerful. And what we used to call the iron triangle of Japan Inc. In the sort of 1980s and 1990s, the sense that big business, the Keidanren, together with the LDP, together with the sort of the major ministries, were essentially running Japan as a kind of Japan Inc., as Americans used to call it. That absolutely, while it's been it's taken a lower profile in some ways, but that influence of big business, especially on the LDP, must still exist and be a very important explainer of why there's been so little economic reform relative to the apparent political strength of the LDP over the last 10 years. So I'll stop there. It's a very interesting issue about strength and weakness, the nature of leadership, and indeed the point of being Prime Minister.
First, thank you so much, Bill-san, and thank you very much, Hugo, for a wonderful, very fascinating talk. Would you like to respond to Bill-san's comments first, and then we'll take some questions? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll respond quite quickly because I think it'd be quite fun to get into the questions and hear what Bill has to say in response to some of these questions that are being posted. I should say at the very beginning that I'm not an Abe fanboy. I was critical as Bill in terms of Abe's achievements. I think in terms of explaining his longevity, then the framework helps to explain some of those key reforms, especially to sort of the institutions and the core executive within Japanese politics and decision making. In terms of achievements, if we're trying to explain achievements as opposed to longevity, then certainly Abe falls short, and the framework would need to be tweaked in terms of intra-party dynamics to include Komeito and their role, as well as big business and its continuing influence. I think, I've written elsewhere that I think the main achievement of Abe's second administration are those reforms to the core executive and to the position of the Prime Minister. Whether that continues and whether other future Prime Ministers have the other skills in order to make the most of that institutional reform remains to be seen. And I think just one thing to throw out there, actually, if we're highlighting failures of the Abe administration, in terms of foreign policy, I think the relationship with South Korea has been horrendously mismanaged and probably represents the #1 priority for Suga in terms of foreign policy. That has to continue.
Yeah, I think I can probably start asking some questions. So there are some interesting questions, I think, for you and also Bill-san as well. The first question comes from Wolfgang Marx, Dr. Marx. Thank you. To what extent are populism and at least rhetorical extremism on the rise in Japan and potentially influencing the political culture? Is it comparable to Europe and the United States? This one probably for you, Hugo.
So in my classes recently, we've been talking about rising nationalism in Japan and populism. I'll speak on behalf of me and my students. I think the conclusion that we came to was that there are always extremists. We've seen Uyoku Dantai in Japan being loud and vocal, but they've always been loud and vocal, but they're very much on the fringes. I don't think we could necessarily lump Abe into the group of populist leaders that we've seen recently with Trump, with Boris Johnson. I mean, Abe is part of the establishment. He can't really play that populist card very effectively. He's very much part of the elite that populists would be rebelling against. So I don't think there's a huge upsurge, but it's certainly there on the fringes of Japanese politics and society. That would be my take. And the conclusion we came to in our seminars as well this semester.
Okay, and there are two questions I think I'd like to bring you in also, Bill-san. So it comes from Helen McNaughton. First of all, comment on your fabulous lockdown beard, Hugo. Very impressive. To what extent do you think Suga will champion and advance Abe's progress on womenomics and gender equality? He hasn't conveyed great signals yet in terms of appointing his cabinet. And so that's one question, but also related question. More generally, what's the women's role in politics and business, please, from Carol Deering? Thank you.
Well, shall I come in on that? Or
yes, Bill first. Yeah, if you can.
No, I think, and Helen McNaughton was a panelist on a debate that I had on womenomics earlier this week. So we've talked a lot about this. I think that I don't think that Suga is going to prioritize this myself. I think that he may still pay lip service to it, but to make a big difference, he'd have to introduce tax reforms. He'd have to introduce maybe quotas of certain kinds. He'd have to be pushing quotas in politics, for instance, to make a difference. And he'd have to, I think, do a major reform of the labor market. And none of those actually have been on his apparent agenda. So in year one of Suga, I don't think we're going to see womenomics and gender equality being at all really a serious issue. What happens if he's re-elected? I hesitate to speculate. But I don't think it's an important issue for him, and he certainly doesn't sort of ooze diversity in his manner.
Thank you. Hugo, would you like to?
I completely agree with what Bill just said. I don't get the impression that this is a high priority for Suga, and as Helen sort of suggested in her question, I think Abe's agenda is debatable. I think he was largely paying lip service to the issue as well. I don't think we could call Abe any kind of feminist. And thank you for the compliment, Helen, as well. I've been kidding the children that in the run-up to Christmas, my beard is getting bigger and my belly's getting bigger as well, as I morph into Father Christmas.
Okay, and two questions around the rise of China and also US and security policy. So Prime Minister Abe's administration was proactive in reaching out to Europe with economic and security partnerships. Do you think this will be consolidated by Prime Minister Suga or not? Hugo.
I see that's from John. Hi, John. Nice to see you again.
That's right.
He's a Sheffield graduate, currently in Berlin doing a PhD, if memory serves. I mean, I think in terms of security policy, it's going to be sort of business as usual. I don't think Suga's wildly interested in foreign and security policy, and he's just going to continue the momentum of the Abe administration. As regards the Biden administration, I think this is probably, Suga will be breathing a sigh of relief because Abe expended a lot of political and personal capital on trying to be, Trump whisperer #1 and didn't get a huge amount in return from it, I think. So Biden administration should herald a period of stability. And I think, you can see noises being made that suggest that Biden is going to support Japan over rise of China, China's aggression in the East China Sea and so on. So I think it will be continuity very much in that way.
Okay, I think it's related, but this is a question from James. Will Japan welcome any attempt by the US to contain China's rise, or will they try and avoid it?
I think it is a similar kind of answer to that. I think the noise is that, Biden's come out and said that the US-Japan Security Treaty does apply to the Senkaku Islands, and Japan will obviously welcome that. I think Biden will differ from the Obama administration, which was sort of, I suppose, cozier towards China than Japan would have liked. And the multilateral dialogue within the Quad of Japan, India, Australia, and the US, there have been noises from the Biden administration that will be continue and be reinforced. So this is all, welcome as regards Prime Minister Suga, I'm sure.
I think what all I'd add is that someone said on a Japan Society of the UK webinar a couple of weeks ago, a Japanese professor, Japan likes to be just a bit less tough than the US. In other words, it likes a tough US, so it wouldn't welcome a softer Biden policy, particularly on China. But secondly, what Japan, I think, has been doing is two things. One is hedging its relationship with the US by definitely wanting to build relationships with Southeast Asia, with Europe, with the Quad, as Hugo says. But secondly, it has continued perhaps a more long-standing policy of a mixture of engagement and confrontation with China. It has a less binary attitude to China than Trump wished to have, and certainly than some of the debate in Europe gives. Japan as a neighbor realizes that it cannot decouple from China, but it nevertheless obviously wants to resist some of China's more aggressive policies. So it's got a more sophisticated approach and will not want to change that.
Okay, I think I'm just conscious of time. There's one last question from Rachel, because we are lucky to have you two British speakers today. So in England, we have a pretty divided nation. With Brexit especially, is there such a political divide in Japan, even to some extent? Hugo?
I think now you'd probably be in a better position to answer this question. I mean, I get the sense that Japan's not as divided as the UK is, or the US is at this point in time. And I can't really sort of think of what would be the cleavage point, what would be the issue that would create such a stark divide within Japan. I mean, that's my immediate knee-jerk reaction, but Bill, what do you think?
I agree. I think maybe it's helpful to add, my little rider to your populism point earlier, which is to say, I think you're absolutely right. There isn't right-wing populism. Japan's gone through a phase of left-wing populism, or center-left populism, which was the landslide election of the DPJ in 2009. And that somewhat suggested some divide over welfare, inequality, like social safety nets and so forth, but with disappointing results. So as far as those who supported the DPJ is concerned, there was a sort of an anti-elite feeling behind that landslide. There was an anti-LDP feeling that finally built up all those years after the bursting of the bubble, and a rising of the issue of inequality, but unfortunately not with actually any tangible or long-term results. And I think that's probably ended that divide politically, at least for the time being.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time is up, but thank you once again for joining us today, and great questions, and of course, wonderful speakers, Hugo and Bill. And I'd also like to thank all the co-organizers and everyone who joined us today, and particularly Ambassador Kitano for his video message, and Professor John Neary's introduction as well. So we now have our YouTube channel, and some of this year's fair webinars are up on there currently already. So, and early next year, we're planning to hold a few special webinars to officially launch the Center for Japanese Studies. So watch this space and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Stay safe, and wherever you are, have a peaceful festival season. どうもありがとうございました。これ見る間が